Hello, my darlings. Welcome to Shadowlands and a little dig into what are we doing today? Okay, let's have a look at relationship shadows. Okay, we all have relationships, don't we? With ourselves, first and foremost, and then hopefully with others, whether it's a personal relationship, whether it's friendships, also personal, but not quite the same as your beloved, family, and everything else. What happens if we don't recognize what's in our shadow? Those unresolved emotions, those unresolved crises or traumas or events that have happened in our lives. If we don't look at them and we hide them away, if we haven't expressed some kind of feeling or emotion about certain events that may have happened in our lives, we're likely to start to act this out in our relationships. If we don't look at what is inside, we start to project what's inside onto other people quite often. So, for example, as you know, I always use my own shadow as an example. I was in a crazy relationship in the beginning of the 2000s. I left in 2006. So 20 years ago, actually, I left this relationship that had actually brought me to my knees. I'd invested in this relationship, bought land. We had a wild boar farm. We built cabins for a retreat center in the Devon countryside. Greenbelt, right? Not easy to get that kind of permission. But I was with a guy who was so uncertain and unaware of who he is that you would call him classically a narcissist. I'll talk about that in another talk. I was unaware at that time of gaslighting or being gaslit, of the machinations of being manipulated in a love relationship. I'd also at the time gone through a breakdown. And so I was in a very vulnerable place when I met him. I won't go into it all, don't need to. Being the empath that I am, of course, I absorbed a lot of this stuff and started owning his stuff. Now, why could I own his stuff? Not just because I'm an empath, but because I wasn't fully aware of who I am as a person. I wasn't fully aware of what was behind my shadow, what was within my shadow that made me put up with certain behaviors and certain projections, the gaslighting, that I shrank myself to fit into this relationship. I wasn't aware that I was not able to fully love somebody else without changing myself. Why did I think I had to change myself? Because within the shadow was the feeling of being unworthy. And so that unworthiness caused my projection to him of him being worthy of my love. And I did everything possible for this person to recognize and feel that he was loved, while this person's shadow was acting out in a way that couldn't be loved because he hadn't been loved. He didn't come from that background. He came from a very cold-hearted, unfeeling, unemotional background, So and boarding school. He'd been put in boarding school from the age of 5, very young, unusual from 5. It's usually around 6, but he'd been in boarding school. His parents were left in South Africa as he was sent to the UK. So, of course, he had learned to hide his emotions. That little boy in him had learned to be tough, to learn to play the game, learned to not allow the sadness, the loneliness, the grief of loss of his parents. And this lived on and on with him. It wasn't just me he was like this with, he was like this, with his ex-wife, which is why she became his ex-wife ultimately. And he would play on the mind. I never quite worked out whether he was conscious of this until I left and I could look back on my shadow, what was within me, what I had projected onto him as the hero, the knight in shining armor, come to save me. Quite the opposite. He was the persecutor, the punisher, is what he was. And I accepted this because I'd also um, not properly um, disseminated and dissolved, recognized my own um, victimhood that was within the shadow. So all these kind of things can come out in relationships. Uh, Shadow playing against shadow. So you're not person to person. You're projecting, each is projecting their own reality onto the other who has a different agenda, you know? So shadow work. This is one of the reasons we look at it. Why are those projections? What am I projecting? You know, is this person here that I am looking at and I think I see and I hear and I understand? Am I understanding? Because another thing with relationships, when we're looking at shadow, we each have a tendency to give love in a way that we want to receive love. If another person cannot receive it, you can love all you like. You can do all the actions that show that that person is loved, but you're never going to get there with them until you look at your shadow and they look at theirs. Especially if you're with someone who's gaslighting you, especially if you're with someone who doesn't know what love is, who's never truly experienced unconditional love and acceptance. Anyway, I hope that helps, my darlings. Have a look behind the scenes. Make sure that what's in front of you is not these unresolved issues from childhood stuff and events and past life, other life, as I like to say, repetitions and patterns. Because once we look inside and we can accept what's inside, it can no longer control us. Okay. In that relationship, we were both being controlled by the shadow, both being controlled by the shadow. I went to Indonesia and I found that actually, you know, a distance could reclaim myself and start to look at my own shadow through other relationships, through professional relationships and what have you. Because I wasn't at that time ready to step into relationship just so that more shadow can be projected. This is where the looping patterns come in. A little addition I want to say is bless those relationships like this that teach you what love is not, what not love feels like, because it gives you a better perspective and a different feeling on what love actually is when you encounter what love is. That was just a quick side note.